Welcome back. Last time we finished off chapter 2 with Paul prohibiting the ordination of women. Today he's going to continue on a similar train of thought by laying out the character requirements necessary for ordination. Let's dive in. This saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for the church of God? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into the snare of the devil. Okay, let's stop here for a moment. There are a few things I want to point out. The first thing we should ask is, what is the office that Paul is describing here? And is this meant to be an exhaustive list of all the ordained offices in the church? This is important because Catholics and Orthodox follow a three-office model: bishop, priest, and deacon. Many Protestants follow a two-office model: elder and deacon. Now, there are three words which Paul uses to describe these offices: episkopos, presbyteros, and diakonos. So, is that the three-office model? Well, not so fast. Because Paul never puts all three of those in one spot and differentiates between them. The most he ever mentions at a time is two, and in Titus it seems like he's even using two of them interchangeably. So, the two-office model is confirmed? From a Catholic perspective, we look at the witness of St. Ignatius of Antioch and the rest of church history. Ignatius's writings from the year 105 spell out the three-office model, and that became the uncontested norm in the church for the rest of history. So the most common position today among Catholics is that the three-office model was always intended, even if the terminology was kind of fluid early on. More could be said there, but smarter people than I have weighed in on this. I want to move to a different observation. When Paul talks to Timothy and Titus about these offices, his assumption is that these men, namely Timothy and Titus, will be ordaining the prospective men in question. So the authority and power of ordination will be passed from one man to the next, forming a sort of lineage that can be traced back to Paul or whatever apostle ordained them first. This is the principle behind the Catholic and Orthodox notion of apostolic succession. So while debates can go on about a two-office model versus a three-office model, I think the apostolic succession model is the often overlooked elephant in the room for Protestants. Even if the two-office model is the most biblically warranted, so is apostolic succession, and that's a historical reality that cannot be pulled out of nothing. Another thing I want to point out was the requirement that the prospective candidate be the husband of one wife. First, this does include the assumption that the applicant is male, as we discussed in the previous chapter. However, it also raises the question about his marital status, and this is where we get another common objection to the Catholic Church. In the Western Rite of the Catholic Church, priests make a promise of celibacy upon ordination, so our clergy is unmarried. Some Protestants will look at this verse to attack the Church, stating that 1 Timothy actually requires the opposite, for a clergyman to be married to one wife. However, I have to say this is a pretty lowbrow objection. Protestants who have studied the matter a bit will realize that this passage cannot be a requirement that a man in ministry be married. After all, Paul himself was unmarried. He wouldn't be making a rule for ministry that would exclude himself and make himself unfit to serve. Learned Protestants know that this passage is most likely about preventing polygamists or men who have mistresses on the side from serving in ministry. The Greek literally says that he must be a one-woman man. So while your low-information Protestant might use this argument, the actual denomination he's part of likely has rules allowing for single men to get ordained. I'll add that there's also an ancient interpretation that Paul is saying that a man cannot be ordained if he is married again after the death of his first wife. I don't think that's what he has in mind here, but it's worth mentioning. One last thing I wanted to point out in this section. Paul says the bishop, or overseer, must not be a new convert. There are a few reasons why this is a good idea. First, because a new convert has not yet been immersed in the Christian culture for very long. He won't be familiar with the way his community thinks and acts, the differences of opinion on liturgical matters or whatever other landmines exist in the community. Even today, There are massive cultural differences between evangelicals and Catholics. If you listen to a sermon from a popular evangelical preacher, you'll be thinking to yourself, that's not how we talk about stuff. Even within Catholic circles, there are divisions between traditionalists and more normie Catholics. A convert would be ignorant of these contours and how to navigate them. The other danger is that the convert is in a state of flux in his life. Sure, today he's become Catholic, but how do we know this isn't just a passing fancy or one step on a journey elsewhere? It's tempting when a famous person converts or shows signs of conversion for us to be very excited and rally around that person, to give that person a platform to inspire others. But by the following year, he's already left, and we have egg on our collective faces. This is another danger Paul would have us avoid. Okay, let's move on. Deacons, likewise, must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. The women, likewise, must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let the deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their households well. For those who serve as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. All right, this second section will be the last one we go over today. In this part, Paul gives roughly the same requirements for deacons. Of course, that invites the question, what is a deacon anyway? The Greek word means servant, but that doesn't tell us much. On the one hand, Ignatius of Antioch seems to indicate that this is an ordained position, someone who has received the sacrament of holy orders. However, as we mentioned before, the titles for the various church positions hasn't been hammered out yet in church history at the time that this letter was written. So the word deacon could be referring to a layperson who is a helper in the church. The other thing people might disagree about with this passage is when Paul says the women, too, need to be upright. The Greek language uses the same word for woman and wife, so Paul could be talking about the deacons' wives. Why does this matter? Well, if Paul is meaning women, then he could be referring to female deacons, and that invites some questions about women in official ministry capacities. If Paul is meaning wives, then Paul is just saying the deacons' wives need to be virtuous and upright as well. I'll tell you where I come down on these two questions. Regarding the woman-wife question, I think Paul is thinking the deacons are men, and he's talking about the deacons' wives in verse 11. Because in verse 12, he continues on saying they need to be the husband of one wife. Why would he say that if he just got done saying that women could be deacons? And regarding whether Paul is talking about a formal official church office or a more informal role of a church helper, I think he's talking about a formal ordained office like Ignatius of Antioch was. That doesn't mean every time we see the word deacon in the New Testament it means that, but I think in this particular section, that's what Paul had in mind. And that's where we'll stop for today. See you next time.